it's amazing to have a panel about financial compliance and actually having us four on the panel without using the word tax. And we pretty much talk about taxes, so if you will, take your chances on Slido, you're gonna get also free tax or tax reporting advice here. So take your questions out. This is an open Q&A. We are all very much qualified to answer all your questions in all jurisdictions you're gonna have. Now, I'm Georg Brameshuber. I'm the CEO of Validvent. I'm a CPA in Austria, and right now in the CAST registration process for crypto investment advice, where the most pressing question are twofold, and I think we're going to unpack this in course of this panel. Question number one is, well, I make a lot of money on the internet. How do I protect my money I made on the internet from the taxman? Question number one. Question number two is, what is all this reporting about? So it is amazing that I have you all here. So maybe a first quick intro from all of you. Max, you want to start? Who you are, why you're here, and what do you do?
Thanks, Georg. Max Bernt, my name. I'm Global Head of Regulatory Affairs and European Managing Director at Taxbit. It's my fourth or fifth Blockchain for Europe Summit, and I was just discussing with a couple of members that have known me for a long time, and I started to talk about DAC 8 and CARF like back in 2020, 2021 already, and people were like, what does this guy want from us, telling us about taxes in the crypto space and the information reporting? Maybe also to clarify here, we're not going to talk about taxation, so substantive tax issues with crypto, but actually on the other side more about financial transparency, so basically how to enable governments to enforce taxation on individuals, and then also get the input from Nick on how individuals can comply with that. So pleasure to be here. Thank you. Paul?
Yes, same for me. Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Hondius. I work for the OECD, and then always a lot of people say, including 4 minutes ago, what is the OECD? We're an international organization that brings together about 150 countries to work on matters of financial policy. And one of the things that we've been doing in the last couple of years, and that I've had the pleasure of working on, is a reporting framework for crypto assets that is now being transposed as a global standard across the world, and that we will no doubt speak about in the next 20 minutes or so. So thanks a lot for the invitation, and pleasure to be here.
Great that you're here. Nick?
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Nick Waytula. I'm the head of tax at SUMM, formerly known as Crypto Tax Calculator. We actually just went through a rebrand a couple weeks ago. And I'm a lawyer from the US and have specialized in taxes for the last 6-7 years, so you know I'm one of the fun guys at the party.
Nick, it's great that you're here because that truly shows that crypto tax reporting is a global phenomenon now. Max, unpack it for us. What is it exactly, and what we're going to have to report?
Yes, thank you, George. So maybe also taking a step back, crypto asset reporting framework. I mean, especially in the area of taxation, we often throw around quite a lot of acronyms. When we talk about CARF, what we mean is the crypto asset reporting framework, which was basically built upon the common reporting standards that have been established in the core banking space, the CRS, that are also a global standard that applies in 115, 120 plus jurisdictions. So we now have the crypto asset reporting framework that was launched by the OECD in order to create more financial transparency in the space. And when people talk about financial transparency, I think one of the key things I want to flag here is if you do investigations, what you see is that you have a blockchain. Everyone here in the room knows what's a blockchain. It's a very transparent ledger, generally speaking, if we don't talk about privacy coins. But from an investigation perspective, the way it usually works is you use an on-chain tracing tool, maybe Chainalysis, TRM Labs, and the likes, for on-chain tracing, and then you hit an exchange, and suddenly there's a black box, right? Because all of these transactions that are happening on the exchange are happening on the internal transaction ledger, so they are not conducted on an actual blockchain in most cases. So basically, up until now, for any kind of investigation work, you would need to actively go to an exchange, subpoena information or request information, and they then provide you with this information about an individual and what they did on that platform. Now, this onus is reversed, and actually reporting crypto asset service provider, which is a very broad definition, will need to report data that is relating to customer activity to the tax administrations where they are incorporated in, which is a game changer for any kind of investigations, because now you have the on-chain piece, which is transparent anyways, and which you can trace using on-chain analytic tools, and then you can combine it also with the off-chain data piece, and then get basically a complete set of data also for financial audits, right? So this was kind of like the core basis for the crypto asset reporting framework. So what does the crypto asset reporting framework now mean? And how does it achieve financial transparency? It's like there's 3 core steps that are introduced by the CARF and by its regional transposition into European Union law, which is called the DAC 8, the 8th Amendment to the Directive on Administrative Cooperation. I always like to compare this to the travel rule. Every one of you knows the travel rule. The travel rule got implemented in Europe via the Transfer Funds Regulation. The CARF is implemented in the European Union via DAC 8. This is like how it works. So basically what they introduce is first service providers from January 1st, 2026. So we're talking 2.5 weeks. Will need to start collect tax identification numbers of all of the new users, plus also for all of the pre-existing users, and need to start tracking every single transactions their users do on their platform, because by the end of the year, they need to then aggregate all of the transactions per asset, in and outgoing flows, and report this data per user together with the tax identification numbers, or the equivalent that applies in an individual jurisdiction. For example, in the UK, you have a NINO, not a tax identification number, that is then reported to the local administration. That's the second step, right? So due diligence requirements on service providers, reporting to the government, and then the government receives all of these data sets and is part of the automatic exchange of information regime of the OECD, which spans across 70 plus jurisdictions. So if I'm a German taxpayer trading on a UK-based exchange, all of the data will be provided to HMRC, and then HMRC sends this data, because based on the tax identification number that I provide them with, they identify me as a German taxpayer, sends this data to the German tax authorities that then can use it for their enforcement.
Thanks, Max, for this introduction. I would now sum it up in a very short question. Does this all lead to a global crypto wealth register on user basis? And if not, why not?
It's a very good question, because usually people ask then, hey, does this lead to harmonization of tax rules? And the answer is no, because it has nothing to do with de facto taxation, but just financial transparency, as I explained. So a global wealth register, and yes and no. I mean, I think what's more important is that finally administrations will know who owns crypto, right, and who's trading, because it's transaction-based reporting.
Yeah. So there we are. Ultimately, the OECD has a very strong legacy in pursuing transparency, especially tax transparency, in the sense that taxes are efficiently collected by OECD member countries. Now, all this fight against tax evasion has a very, very, very long history, and then came crypto, right? We are also celebrating now the 10th anniversary of Headquist. What is the role of taxes, and especially tax reporting, tax compliance, financial compliance within crypto overall, and which role did the OECD particularly play here, Paul? Just as a sum it up what Max introduced us to you from your side, from the OECD side.
Yes, good question, and could speak a lot about it, but I'll focus on the essence. I think it's right to say that this tax transparency work really commenced with what I think was labeled in the broader public and political scene as the end of bank secrecy. Some of
Absolutely.
you will still remember that in 2014 when we did the common reporting standard on foreign bank accounts. And then there was a question, okay, what do we do with crypto? Because that was seen as a potential alternative asset class to having more traditional financial products. And the first temptation was to build it into the common reporting standard, but then I think for a host of reasons, the decentralized, the disintermediated nature of crypto, we realized that we needed something fresh, and that's why we did the crypto asset reporting framework that Max has just outlined. And what we typically do at OECD level, working with the membership, is drafting model legislation, which we have done now already 2 to 3 years ago. And then, of course, we need to make sure that with the backing of relevant political bodies, such as the G20, this then becomes an international standard that actually then gets spread out over the world. And that's very much the process that we're in now.
Yeah, absolutely. What is interesting and which stands a little bit out is that the crypto asset reporting framework came alongside the first, let's put it that way, milestone jurisdictions like MiCAR. And there is a lot of nexus, let's put it that way, between the crypto asset reporting framework and MiCAR. Also because the reporting crypto asset service provider, it uses the same, more or less the same definitions, but there are still a lot of, I would say, overlaps and underlaps, let's put it that way. And I would like to particularly put it towards, that's what we all call DeFi. How you will see the DeFi space, not only from the tax transparency spectrum, but especially with regard to the crypto asset reporting framework and how the DSC8 plays around with it. From both the services side as well as the overall scope of which should be held under transparency. It's funny that you say we wanted to fight bank secrecy laws back then with transparency, and crypto ultimately and the decentralized world eventually was there or was being built in order to unbank the people. So transparency, that's all where we are.
Well, I mean, I think this is always work in progress in a certain way. I mean, I think when you try to define this kind of a framework, you try to capture notions that are very general and try to make sure that they survive a bit the test of time. And so I think two things that we have very concretely done is that we have developed this notion of Max referred to it, of a reporting crypto asset service provider, which is an entity or an individual in a nutshell that has significant control or influence over either a crypto asset exchange or another intermediate role in the crypto asset framework, such as, for instance, somebody that is a broker or the like, or also a more traditional financial institution offering crypto products. Of course, developments go on, right? There's new developments, and we need to keep track of them and see whether our framework responds appropriately to them. And where necessary, engage in debates on whether adjustments are needed. I think probably the two technical issues that are at the moment most on our radar are the questions of how do we ensure appropriate and adequate reporting in relation to stablecoins. There's a lot of regulatory development going on, including under the EU e-money directive and the Genius Act, for instance, in the United States. And also a big topic for us is the tendencies in more traditional financial markets where crypto is used increasingly for tokenizing more traditional financial assets, such as shares, but also bonds or units in money market funds and the like. So I think those are some of the technical issues that we're currently working on in terms of refining the work that we did, which is already some years ago, which of course is an eternity in this kind of space.
Yeah, thanks for that. Nick, over to you. If we are listening to Max and to Paul, I would say the level of my personal tax anxiety is pretty much rising up. Now, what's your view on that? Not on your view personally or individually, but especially if you're serving a lot of taxpayers ultimately globally. I think you're supporting over 40 jurisdictions now worldwide with Crypto Tax Calculator now rebranded as SUMM. What's your view on this?
Yeah, so CARF, Crypto Asset Reporting Framework, is honestly going to change a lot of people's lives. Whether it's for the better or for the worse, that's up to you to decide. But what it means, and Max alluded to it earlier, it's the transfer or the reporting of mass data, right? So every single transaction you have on an exchange or a wallet or otherwise entity that needs to be reported, it's going to be transparent. Now, we think, the blockchain's transparent already. Yes, on one hand, on-chain transactions are always transparent, but off-chain transactions, right, centralized exchanges, things like that, they're not necessarily transparent. And you can't just go in and get the records. You can't just look at Max or Paul's blockchain wallet and know what they're transacting on. So the fact that tax authorities are going to have just a heap of information on their taxpayers is really going to change the future of taxation in these countries, in my opinion. we're going from more of an opt-in model where you have to voluntarily report your crypto and your transactions to, your tax authority, to an opt-out model. So, all of these tax authorities are going to have their, the information on all of these taxpayers. So if you don't want to report, or if you think crypto's anonymous, if you're still one of those people, then you have to voluntarily opt out of reporting your transactions and reporting your activity, in which case, you have to be prepared for audits or the penalties that come with it. So yeah, CARF is really going to open a lot of people's minds in the next couple years, and the fact that, you have to go from an opt-in to an opt-out model is really going to increase compliance, not only in the EU, but really around the world. We're seeing it in the US right now. So the US is adopting CARF a little bit later on, I believe in 2029. However, they implemented the 1099-DA, which is an official tax form that the taxpayer as well as the IRS, the American Tax Authority, receive. And what that does is force compliance for the users, and in turn really forces the users to give money to these tax authorities and to these governments. So, on one hand, you have the transparency of the data, you have the tax authorities knowing who has crypto, who's transacting, what are they doing, and on the other hand, you have a bunch of revenue coming in for these governments that hopefully, they do the right things with.
Thanks on that. Just I think it was in 2011 or 2012, then finally adopted by the G20, that tax evasion is an offense to money laundering. Now, 2015, Silk Road was ultimately brought down by actually tax offenses in the US. It was an IRS agent who brought finally the Silk Road down. And if you're talking about, for example, within Blockchain for Europe and also in the course of this conference, I think financial compliance in the sense of taxation gets very limited talking time overall. Although if we look at the essence, it's very much important. Would you share that agreement, and how and which role does financial compliance in terms of tax compliance, financial reporting compliance have overall? What's your perspective from public sector, Max, and then Nick afterwards?
You want to start or shall I? Okay. That's actually a very, very, very good point. I mean, everyone knows Al Capone was caught by taxes, right? And there's no easier way to get an asset seizure than through a case of tax evasion or like through any tax debt. It's a very good point. I think it ties in well together with one common questions I always encounter is because maybe just to clarify, there's also like a lot of offshore entities that will be in scope, right? Your typical countries where usually these entities incorporate. And a question I get is usually, why does the UAE enforce CARF? Or why do they even comply? There's no taxes on crypto in the UAE, right? And that ultimately brings us to exactly the point you raised. It has nothing to do with the taxation aspect of it, but more with the financial crime and financial transparency use case. And that's also why, for example, FATF put CARF and CRS up the evaluation list, and a lot of countries are now actually saying, hey, we need to comply with CARF and CRS because otherwise we are threatened to get grey listed, right? So there is a big point on the financial crime side as well when it comes down to the CARF and CRS reporting. And it's also the way it's being enforced, because if we look at the penalty regime of most jurisdictions that implement CARF and then require service providers to comply with it, many of them have very stringent penalties on the service providers that can lead up to the withdrawal of license, for example, in the UAE, right, as an example.
Yes, maybe just to add to that I think the policies that we're putting in place to provide tax administrations with relevant information on crypto asset transactions of their taxpayers, they certainly have an evasion angle to them, but I think they also have a very important tax compliance angle, and through that a financial compliance angle to them. It's of course also a bit of a cultural thing. I mean, I think if you would ask, for instance, a Scandinavian tax administration what their intention is with this information, they will probably typically tell you, well, for us the ideal scenario is that we pre-fill the taxpayer's tax return with this information, the taxpayer reviews it online in 25 seconds, says yes, that's correct, and then we can proceed with taxation, where in other parts of the world this will be probably much more used as an instrument to tackle non-declaration after the event. And so I think it can serve both purposes, and sort of depending on where you kick in the process and what your strategy is, there's either a stronger criminal aspect to it or a much weaker criminal aspect based on the same information. And both uses are possible, of course.
Nick?
Yeah, they both covered it very well. Not a whole lot to add to that, but I do think it's going to, kind of like what Max was saying earlier, it's going to open up the world to these issues, right? So out of, I believe, 67 or so countries adopted CARF, is that correct?
74.
74, thank you for the correction. Of the 74, that's about half, right? So you got to think that more countries will start to see what's going on in these 74. They're going to see the revenue coming in. They're going to see whether it's criminal or financial aspects to this, to CARF. They're going to see it coming in, and they're going to think, okay, we need to do that for our taxpayers. So whether it's a country or like the Cayman Islands, for example, not a lot of taxes are being paid in the Cayman Islands, but it's still relevant because people are establishing entities there. They're establishing businesses. They're living there for 6 months and 1 day out of the year to avoid U.S. taxes. So it's going to be very important that all of these countries come together to start transmitting this data, so that not only the country where you live has access to your transactions, your information, but the countries where maybe you have a dual citizenship, or you live there for a few months out of the year, but you still transact in crypto there. So it's going to be very important to see over the next few years how it's implemented, and which countries are left behind, I should say. The ones that are left behind, it's going to be interesting to see what they do to catch up to the rest.
And one more thing, would you also reflect on what Paul said? It was very interesting on the cultural difference in let's put it that way, tax, self-assessment, tax collection.
Yeah, huge cultural differences. For example, in the US, people don't want to pay taxes. We don't get a receipt that says, your $20,000 of tax money went here, here, and here. We have no idea where it goes. It could be anywhere right now. But for example, in other countries around the world, you get an invoice, all of your tax dollars went here, here, and here. Or for example, some countries want to pay taxes. The individuals want to pay taxes. They feel like it betters their country and betters, their government. So the cultural differences are huge, especially when you consider, again, countries like the US, where the taxpayers will do anything and everything to avoid paying taxes.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking financial compliance here. Now, let's bring this a little bit in the balance, also regarding the cultural shift. Now I'm asking you very broadly. I mean, addressing financial compliance is also addressing almost a reversal of the burden of proof, right? So it is every individual taxpayer has to declare him or herself free in order to be fully tax compliant at one point. Another point is a fundamental right, also to protect your fundamental rights in terms of earnings, equity, income. Where do you see that balance, especially with Web3, self-determination, self-hosting? Paul?
Yeah, it's of course an important aspect of designing such a framework. I mean, it of course doesn't operate in isolation. If we write this model legislation at OECD level, we of course understand that this is going to be legislation in the context of a particular legal order, with a constitution, with fundamental rights, with jurisprudence, etc. And I think I mean, this is all these exchanges, it's also maybe good to clarify, are based on an international treaty. And that international treaty by design limits the use and the dissemination of this information. So this information cannot be shared freely with other government agencies or with other, let alone with other countries or private people. And it's also very clear that it can only be used for taxation and related crimes, financial crimes. And also, of course, it acknowledges that there are such things such as data protection rights, rights to correction, rights to deletion, a right to an administrative procedure to rectify mistakes. And so those things, of course, we take very seriously. I mean, this is not sort of the transparent citizen in accordance with the principle, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. Very much to the contrary, we try to build something that is sustainable and also reflects that this is not the only priority in the world, but there are also other legal principles that are worth maintaining.
Max?
Yeah, and maybe to add to this, because it's a question that often comes up, right, is the whole question around how much is DeFi in scope. This has been a discussion we had at the OECD level as well, and the OECD clarified this via the FAQs, that basically it depends on so basically, first of all, it doesn't matter if you hold custody of an asset or if you're non-custodial in nature, as long as you effectuate a transaction for and on behalf of your customer as a business, you are in scope of CARF and you're therefore a reportable entity. So it doesn't matter if you hold custody or not. That's the first point. Second point then is, the question is, the platform that effectuates these transactions, do you hold control or sufficient influence over it? And this COSI assessment is what's now key part of determining if an individual entity would be in scope of the reporting requirements, yes or no. This was now deferred to the Financial Action Task Force to determine how these COSI assessments should be conducted by the authorities. But in general, what we are seeing is two things. The first question is, are you capable of restricting access to an account? Because then you would hold control, sufficient influence over it. And second, do you earn money with the product? I mean, I think in most jurisdictions, there's always a question of follow the money, right? So there's still a lot to be considered in the context of DeFi here. And then also, of course, in the context of privacy, because I mean, ultimately, I was talking about internal transaction ledgers versus a public blockchain. It's also an enormous risk. Imagine now if like wallets get reported to the tax administration, then there's a data leak. I'm suddenly a public book. So I think that's one of the core challenges, and maybe just to also reiterate. One important piece is like the scope of a reportable entity is broader than just like a MiCA license player, right? So staking, lending is in scope. And one more thing from an individual point of view, so that everyone understands what this means for an individual, these regulations, not just for the service providers. Basically, when I sign up with a crypto service provider from 1st of January, they will need to ask me about my tax identification number. And if I don't provide it to the service provider, that by the way needs to also do some due diligence, needs to comply with due diligence requirement in order to validate the reasonableness of the provided TIN, they need to freeze my account. So basically, if I don't provide the TIN within 60 days, my account with the service provider gets frozen under Dark 8 in the European Union.
Yeah. No, but by the way, also on the definition on DeFi, that's a very, very nicely put, in all simplicity, definition of what is DeFi and what is not DeFi, especially in denomination of Bitcoin and all the other so-called DeFi aspects here. So please do read it up afterwards. It's a very good definition in terms of what Bitcoin really is and what all the other probably are. One last point to round this up is let's put it that way, the elephant in the room, also with new technologies emerging, artificial intelligence and so on and so forth. We are talking data, right? And data itself lends to a lot of automation. Now we have two, let's put it that way, software provider on stage as well as one, let's put it that way, public entity, who put the idea already in the room that real-time tax compliance would be a beautiful thing, especially if you talk to a taxpayer in the Nordics. Now give us, as a roundup, a very short rundown. Let's say we are in the 40th edition of Blockchain for Europe. Do we still have tax reporting requirements, or is everything reported automatically because data is there anyway and we just harvest the data? Nick?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's definitely going to be tax reporting still. In an ideal world, it's built into every smart contract where whatever tax bracket you fall in, 25% of your gains get automatically sent to the government, so you don't ever have to worry about it. But personally, I don't like that. I like me being the one to pay the government my taxes and me being the one to report it. I think a lot of crypto taxpayers around the world are skeptical of the government. It just comes with the nature of the industry that we're all in. So I don't feel like it's going to go away. But hopefully, over the next few years, next 10 years, whatever it is, it becomes a little bit more streamlined. Because as of right now, it's a completely manual process. You have to, SUMM, for example, you have to upload all of your data. If you forget to add a wallet or something like that, it might house critical tax information, like your acquisition date or cost basis, things like that. So, yeah, we'll see.
I love it, and you're not alone. Thanks for making it stick. There's one question on Slido, which basically puts it to a right to access of data which is stored and reported for the individual as well. It could be used not also in order for defense audit purposes, but especially for positive self-audits, corrections, also for transparency for the individual itself. Would it be something which would achievable, let's put it that way, that also the person, the taxpayer, which data is basically reported, has also access to the reporting files?
To the data itself?
Yes.
You mean a customer copy?
Yes, for example.
So basically in the United States, that's already the case, that the customer receives also a copy, and also in the European Union, if you look at DAC 8 implementation, Ireland, Luxembourg, I think Luxembourg, and someone else also, like there's 3 countries. It's Ireland and Luxembourg for sure. They provide data, also customer copies as part of the information reporting by the service provider, so the customer would receive a copy of the information that was reported. So of course, like there's always a way that also for the service providers, this would be like they could give it to their clients in order for them to make it easier. But if you ask me where we end up with automation of taxation with crypto assets, I do think that there is an ongoing trend towards more disintermediation via AI agents that will also interact with DeFi, and that more and more trust will be delivered to AI agents, and then probably also being the ones that then organize our taxes. We'll see how much of that we can automate.
Thanks, everybody. Now I think we hand over to our agent of ceremony. Thanks, everybody on the panel. Big applause for everybody. Thanks so much.